Good morning, Ryan. I'm really excited to talk to you today in this rainy day about the public humanities here in New Haven. So to begin, I was wondering if you could just introduce yourself and tell us your role here in New Haven and at Yale.
So my name is Ryan Brasseaux. I am the Dean of Davenport College. I'm also a lecturer in American Studies, which means that when I wear my American Studies hat, I'm involved in the Public Humanities at Yale. I teach the introductory course, Introduction to Public Humanities, which is a joint undergraduate seminar that explores the ideas and dynamics of what is the public humanities. It's also a project-driven course, meaning instead of a usual seminar paper, there's a collaborative project that students develop, cultivate, curate, and put into the world.
I'm really excited to talk to you about it because I got to be in that class last year, my first year being in the PhD in American Studies here at Yale. It was an incredible experience for my first semester of grad school to get to be in your course. I was hoping before we talk about the class, I wanted to hear a little bit about your path into the public humanities.
So I grew up in Louisiana. That place and space is rich with folklore, rich with vernacular culture, and I was always fascinated by the vernacular world. When I was an undergraduate, I thought the best way to get into this would be through folklore studies. So it all really began there as an undergraduate. It was me exploring the idea of what is Mardi Gras, for instance? What is music in a space like Louisiana? What does cuisine mean in a space like that? So it's not just what people were doing in cultural production, but also the meaning that surrounded whatever that cultural production was. I said, I'm going to explore what are some of those bridges that could get me into those spaces and those ideas. And it's the strange liminal space between the public and the academy. So I did museum exhibit design for 4 or 5 years. That allowed me to think, different media would allow me to tell a story in a very different way. I also did radio. The idea was to explore vernacular culture through that lens. I also did work in oral history. There was something powerful about collecting people's stories and sitting and listening, but also what does it mean to receive that story? There's a real exchange that happens. Someone will present their vulnerable selves to you. And so understanding what it means to accept that story, validate that story. Oral history and radio helped me intersect those sorts of ideas, how to engage with people in a meaningful way. When I arrived on campus at Yale, where I did my doctoral studies, a series of conversations were beginning to happen on campus. Matt Jacobson was a great ally, Laura Wexler. We began to talk about what would it mean to think about that space between the public and the academy, that space between the classroom and the community. Public humanities grew out of that.
What did that look like for you when you were doing your PhD in American Studies here at Yale?
So when I was in Louisiana, I was at state schools, which have a public mandate. So it has to be public-facing because it's publicly funded. When you arrive at a private institution, there is no public mandate. And it intrigued me because it was my first experience with a private institution. I absolutely enjoyed my work in seminars, the readings, all the class time. But there was always that piece of me that was dormant, the piece that wanted to engage the broader community. It was at once a real education in terms of the traditional graduate school experience. And I became more and more intrigued by New Haven as a space, as a place. So I began to explore more community engagement, the kind of public humanities work that I had done, and figuring out what is this new place and space that I live in. It happened within the classroom, to be sure, but also outside of the classroom.
And so now, as you've been working on designing this course over the past many years, how did those questions coalesce in a syllabus and a course design?
When the conversations began with Matt Jacobson and Laura Wexler about, could there be something like a public humanities entity on campus? Something beyond strictly a speaker series, something beyond strictly outreach and engagement that we were doing at the time. And said, what if we actually situate this in a classroom setting? What would that look like? If I recall correctly, Matt taught the very first iteration of this course. And I remember sitting in on it. I had already completed my coursework. I wanted to see what he was going to teach. We had conversations about what to teach, how to think about this, how to think about the university as hierarchy, how to think about collaboration within that kind of setting, how to think about mitigating, maybe even subverting that hierarchy. What would that look like? And so the syllabus began with these ideas, and it grew again out of conversation. It grew out of broad reading lists. Several years in, when I took this job, the deanship, Matt approached me and said, would you consider teaching public humanities? I said, well, sure. But then I thought, okay, I have to now translate all of the practical experience that I've had and say, how do I think about this in a classroom setting? So it was a translation process for me to think about how do I talk about this in a way that could fuse together theory and praxis. And to me, that's always been the goal as I've taught this course. Where's that intersection between theory and praxis? We developed 6 pillars of the public humanities. There's documentary, public art, museum studies and curatorial practices, history in the public, digital humanities, place, and space. And these were areas of resourcefulness on campus, people who were actively working in the field. This was a very interdisciplinary approach. The course now reflects these 6 pillars. I've tried to find readings and experiences that could bridge the gap between theory and practice, between the academy and the community, by focusing on these sorts of organizational points. It has to be experiential. It has to be something more than just a classroom setting. The idea is to constantly think about pushing students outside of the classroom.
And that was what was so incredible for me taking the class last year. My first few months living in New Haven, I moved here a month before our PhD program started. Every other week we were at the New Haven Museum. We were out. We talked to community leaders throughout Fairhaven and throughout New Haven and got to meet all these people doing work here in New Haven. And so it was an incredible way to be introduced to this new space that I was in. So as we were moving through these 6 pillars, then we were also as a class the whole time thinking about the collaboration that we would do together. And so that's also what's so creative and exciting about this course is that it's really enacting that spirit of creation and collaboration within this insanely tight timeline of a semester. So would you talk about the second part of that curriculum and pedagogy of what happens in the end of the semester?
So this is a class without a net. And it always makes me a bit anxious and nervous to think we have a deadline. It's a firm deadline. It happens. The idea is that there's going to be a project. There's something about the stress of a deadline that helps create the kind of collaboration you hope to see. It forces people to be active. And there's no space for stopping. There's no space for pulling the plug. The stress of that, it creates a collaborative space. It also collapses the hierarchy that happens on campus. So it's a joint grad-undergrad course. The idea is there's no distinction suddenly between grad student and undergraduate. It's about we must create this project now. There's one parameter about the project. It's to say it has to be about the local. It has to be about the city of New Haven, communities who make up the city of New Haven. I encourage students to be creative. That's constantly the push and pull in the class is to say, learn about this space, learn about the communities here. You're not of the communities, but find ways to collaborate and build bridges to those communities. How do you meet in the middle? That's the constant question. That's the constant goal.
And so would you tell us about some of the projects that have emerged then over the past?
Well, let's talk about the High Watermark first. You were a part of what I think is one of the great projects that have come out of the class. The idea was to take 4 different locations in the city of New Haven, 4 different establishments, restaurants as community space, as community centers, community anchors, and bring in the proprietors, the cooks, the establishment owners, and have them narrate their own story around what does this food mean to me? What does this food mean to my neighborhood? And we brought people together to hear these stories. Across the night, there were 4 different courses, 4 different stories. Not only did you hear the proprietor talk about what they were doing, we showed documentary shorts, and then you got to sample the food and the cuisine that came from that particular restaurant. It was a tremendously successful night. We actually sold tickets to the event. We sold out within 24 hours, and it was as diverse a group as I've ever seen in one space. It wasn't just about the city of New Haven. This project outgrew the city. People had come in from around the state, which was astonishing to me. People had driven in from Bridgeport. People had driven in from Monroe. People had driven in from Hartford just for this event. So it was a beautifully curated experience.
Would you talk a little bit about who we featured?
We decided to think about different neighborhoods and who were stalwarts of neighborhoods. Sandra's Next Generation out of the Hill, the best soul food in New Haven, if you ask me. She was on hand to talk about her food, and she presented fried chicken. Cositas Deliciosa out of Fairhaven, a great story about a family who decided to open a market that didn't establish roots very well in the neighborhood on Grand Ave, and instead transformed that into a restaurant. It has been wildly successful since they've transitioned. And so they've become a kind of anchor on Grand Avenue. So while we were thinking about places with roots in neighborhoods, we also thought about what does it mean to be uprooted? And so Sanctuary Kitchen features the cuisine and the culinary traditions of refugees, often from places like Syria, war-torn places. By collaborating with them, we also got to hear a very different idea about what does it mean to inhabit the spaces around New Haven? What does it mean to present food that is the thing that really connects people back to a tradition and to a history and to stories? But it was people who were uprooted, and that's how they landed here. And then we decided to dig into the Italian-American traditions in the city of New Haven, which are broad, wide, and deep. And we offered dessert from one of the local Italian-American establishments in town.
What I loved about being a part of this project, too, is the idea of centering the experience of being together, this sort of community fellowship of this event, but then there were all these other documentary elements that then sort of reverberated from that space of being together. So we had these documentary short films that we made on each proprietor, their family stories. Some people had just beautiful footage from being in the restaurants that we shared at the event. And then we also made a cookbook that we shared with everybody with photographs and recipes and stories about the restaurants. And then we also made a website. And so it was this really multidisciplinary project but was rooted really in that one space as the focus, and then enabled sort of all these other things to exist in concert. So I really loved being a part of that project.
It happened across different registers.
Yeah.
And to me, that's why it was so exciting.
Yeah.
It was to say, well, you got to taste it. It was experiential for everyone in the room. You got to see the documentary short, but then there was a short oral history with the proprietor. So you got to hear it in different ways and experience it in different ways. It was a tremendous night.
And to me, all of those things were sort of, as all of us as students were grappling with this question of what is the public humanities? I mean, that course in and of itself gave us such a expansive way of thinking about it as both something that we're embodying together and also has the material pieces that are products of the class. And it's incredible because every year you have a completely different group of students showing up on the first day of shopping period, and you have no idea who's going to be in the class and what skills they bring. So what have you found over the years brings people to that course from all these different places across the university?
I think that people are really interested in connecting with other people. And not just within the university setting, but the students who are conscious that they live in a city that is not defined by the university helps change the dynamic. If you're a graduate student and you don't live on campus, you live in a neighborhood. And as you go about your daily business, you go to the coffee shop, you go to the restaurant, you go to the grocery store, you get to see people in the neighborhood. Undergraduate students who understand that one institution doesn't define a place or a space are deeply engaged with the public humanities and the class in part because they're interested in learning more about the context around Yale. And so that helps define who's in the class. The emphasis is always on community engagement. It's students who are interested in community engagement.